Do you want to start flowers from seed, but you're not sure when to do it? This one's for you. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. If you love the idea of growing a cut flower garden from seed or growing your own beautiful landscape plants from seed, but you're overwhelmed by when to start the seeds and transplant out, or if you just want to simplify your seed starting life with flowers, I have a super easy method for you today. This video is all about when to start your flower seeds. I've done the legwork by synthesizing information from the best seed and flower experts to give you a general guideline that will work for virtually any climate and any grower as long as you have a frost-free growing season of at least 2 to 3 months. So it doesn't matter what zone you grow in, I'm giving you some general guidelines that will help you get gorgeous blooms as early as possible in the spring and summer months. So basically, grab your seed packets, print the totally free cheat sheets that I have for you, and we can sort them according to their groups. Doing this ahead of time means that your seeds will be ready and easy for you to grab and start indoors in a greenhouse or direct sow them whenever their time comes. The flowers I have for you fit into a couple of different categories. There are cool hardy flowers which tolerate cold and actually prefer a cold start to become established in the early spring. Some of these cool hardy flowers will even perennialize for you depending on the growing zone that you're in, and some of them are annuals and will go through one cycle of blooming in their lifetime. And then there are also warm season annuals that love warm soil and warmer temperatures that are just gorgeous. And many plants from either category will readily reseed each spring and even in the fall, giving you blooms for years to come. An important piece of information you're going to need to know is your location's estimated last frost date in the spring. If you don't know it already, you'll need to do a web search for it. Farmer's Almanac is a good resource online, you can find it. But you'll want to find out what that date is for you and write it down. And in the document that I'm sharing with you in the video's description below, I have a spreadsheet tool linked that is a calculator that will help you easily count back and calculate the number of weeks before your last frost date for each of these groups. You'll just print these little cheat sheets, add the calculated dates here, and you're ready to start seeds for the entire spring. So let's look at each of the groups on the timeline and I'll tell you what's in it and I'll give you some important tips on some of them as well. I have them grouped here in Ziploc bags. You could also just use rubber bands with the lists to keep them together. I should note that these recommended dates are for starting indoors or in a greenhouse, and the majority of this group can actually be transplanted out into the garden, believe it or not, before your last estimated frost date. They just have to be properly hardened off in order to do so. The first thing on this list is native perennials. Now, I can't tell you offhand what your native perennials are because they're specific to your area, but a quick web search will help you to find some good ones. Some common ones in North America are black-eyed Susan, sweet Joe pieweed, and swamp milkweed, which provides a really necessary habitat for monarch butterflies. Native perennials can typically be started from seed very early in the year, and many of them can even be planted out safely before your last frost date in the spring. So any native perennials are good to start at this time frame. Next is bachelor buttons. Bachelor buttons produce these really magical little blue, pink, purple, or white blooms, and they're really early bloomers in the spring. Then there's Cresspedia, otherwise known as billy buttons, and they're super cute little cut flowers, and they produce lots of little yellow baubles, little spheres over the spring and summer. Then there's Delphinium. Delphinium is a gorgeous, really tall, spiked flower that's a perennial in many zones and grows in a lot of cooler zones of the northern US. Not all varieties of Delphinium will flower the first year, but if you start them early enough indoors, you can often get some of them to bloom the first year. Delphinium seeds do need a period of cold stratification, so a period of cold and moisture of at least 2 or more weeks in a fridge or a freezer in order to break dormancy. Digitalis or foxglove. They look pretty similar to Delphinium, but they are toxic, so just be aware of that if you have pets or children. Foxglove also needs cold stratification. There's also Echinacea or coneflower, and it's a very drought tolerant and hardy perennial and also does need cold stratification. Then there's eucalyptus. Eucalyptus is a very slow grower, but I've found that it's really not difficult to grow from seed, and it's not cold tolerant, so you're gonna have to transplant it out shortly after your last frost. Then there's feverfew. Feverfew is a great cold tolerant filler flower that comes in some different shapes and a couple of different colors. Also, forget-me-not is on this list. It's very cold tolerant. Then there's hollyhock. Hollyhock may bloom for you in the first year if you start it this early, but it's another one of those tall spike flowers. Then there's lavender. Lavender is also a very slow grower, but it is on this list as well and will perennialize in many zones. Lisianthus. Lisianthus is really slow growing from seed. It takes about 12 weeks to grow out some transplants. So if you want to try it, start at this 12-week mark, or you can even start a couple of weeks sooner than this. Like I said, they are super slow to grow, but they are really worth it in my opinion. They don't mind our hot summers here in Texas, and they'll bloom through them beautifully. Then there's lupins. Lupins thrive in cooler climates and are grown as perennials in zone 6 and below, but here in warmer climates that are zone 7 and above, lupins are grown as annuals. And lupins do need cold stratification. There's monarda or bee balm. It's great for pollinators and also a lovely cut flower. Nigella or love in a mist. It prefers to be direct sown, or you can also start it this early indoors. It's one that's cold tolerant that can be planted out before your last frost date. Orlea is also in this list, as well as penstemon. Penstemon is a perennial in zones 4 and above, and it's typically recommended that you give your penstemon seeds a longer cold stratification period than a lot of these other flowers. Also poppies. Poppies are a cold hardy flower, and some types of poppies can grow as cold as zone 2 or 3, and most will perennialize in many areas. They prefer to be direct sown, and it's best to do that in the fall, but they can be started indoors and transplanted out. They do need a week of cold stratification to break dormancy. Then there's viola or pansy. They're a popular cool season flower that's often grown in warmer climates as an annual for fall or spring blooms because they really struggle in the heat. Pansy seeds do benefit from cold stratification as well. Then there's rudbeckia. There are lots of different beautiful rudbeckias out there. They're slow to get started, but once they're established, they're very drought tolerant, and they do benefit from cold stratification. Then there's snapdragons. Snapdragons can be started 12 weeks before your last frost date. Snapdragons have been bred to have different bloom times, so you might want to think about looking at the different group numbers of snapdragons to determine whether you want an earlier blooming snapdragon like a group 1 and 2, or a later blooming snapdragon like a 3 or a 4 for summertime. Also on this list is Sweet William and also yarrow. And on my little cheat sheet, I did notate which of these need cold stratification in order to get good germination on them. And I should note that any of these seeds in this group that require cold stratification, if you are willing to wait a bit longer on blooms, you can try something called winter sowing. Winter sowing is an excellent and easy way to start native perennials and some of these more cool loving plants. It's my favorite way to start many of these, and it gives me great germination rates and some of the strongest plants. I'll link a video all about winter sowing in the description below this video. Now let's look at the list of seeds that's recommended that you start 10 weeks before your last frost date. There's ageratum, also known as mistflower or floss flower. There's agrostemma, also called corn cockle. That's one that blooms pretty early in the season. Bupleurum, it's a filler flower that's really early blooming, and it does benefit from at least a week of cold stratification. Then there's calendula. Calendula is a cool loving flower that can be used as a cut flower, but also has some healing properties, so it's a really cool one. Larkspur. Larkspur prefers to be direct sown, but you can carefully transplant it. I love larkspur, and I found that it's super easy to grow. It can benefit from cold stratification to improve germination rates, but I found it's not totally necessary. It's also one that I will direct sow in the fall and let it overwinter here in my zone so that I get early blooms in the spring. Next is dill. Dill is on this list because it makes a great addition to cut flower bouquets. and it's a cool loving flower and can be planted out before your last frost. Dusty Miller. Dusty Miller is a commonly grown landscaping plant that's said to be very drought tolerant. It's slow to get started, but it's a really cool looking one. Then there's Statice. I love growing Statice as a cut flower because it has a really long vase life, and then it will also dry really well and hold on to its color very well. Stalk. Most stalks produce one stem and then they're done. This one actually produces 4, but they're really easy to start from seed, so you can start them in this 10-week group and then transplant them out a week or 2 before your last frost date. Also on this list is Sweet Annie, also known as Artemisia or Wormwood. It makes a great green foliage for cut flower arrangements, and it's just a really lovely plant. It can be invasive and some people are allergic to it, so that's something to know. Sweet pea. Sweet peas don't mind freezing temperatures. I'll start them in this group and then transplant them out up to 6 weeks before our last frost. I have found that they're most resilient when transplanted out if I start them in 2-inch soil blocks. I'll mention here that if I get to the end of a window of time and I still haven't sown some of the seeds because I either ran out of time or I forgot, I'll just take that bag and I will tuck it into the next bag in sequence, and that reminds me to start those seeds with the next group as well. It won't make a huge difference to have started them a couple of weeks late. They'll still grow and bloom for me. 8 weeks before last frost, I'll start this next group. Celosia. Celosia or celosia is a cut and come again, heat loving, drought tolerant flower, and there are so many varieties of it. Also China aster. These are the asters that are specifically frost tender, but they're so pretty as cut flowers. Clarkia. Clarkia is a really pretty plant. It grows really tall and would be beautiful in the back of a landscape bed. Then there's Coleus. Coleus is really easy to grow from seed, though it is pretty slow growing. It makes a great shade plant, and a lot of people grow it in containers. Also on this list is cup and saucer vine. Then there are dahlias. Dahlias are often purchased as tubers and grown from tubers, but growing them from seed is really fun, and it's easy and surprising. There are lots of varieties for seeds out there, and I start them around this 8-week mark or the 6-week mark. Godetia or Godetia. It prefers to be direct sown, but it can be started 8 weeks early and planted out after last frost. Gomphrena or globe amaranth. It's maybe the most drought tolerant flower I've ever seen and grown. They love heat and they'll grow into these big bushes full of colorful little globes. Helipterum or paper daisy. That's a really cool one to start at this time. Gomphrena and Helipterum both hold their color really well as dried flowers. Scabiosa. Scabiosa can be planted before last frost. It's pretty cold tolerant, and it grows super tall and has these pretty little fluffy blooms. Then there's strawflower. Some strawflower can actually tolerate a little bit of frost and freezing temperatures, but I love these flowers so much. You can dry them and they hold their color very well and they last forever. Then there's Sweet Alyssum. Sweet Alyssum isn't a cut flower, but it's an awesome companion plant for a vegetable garden. It draws in beneficial insects like ladybugs, hoverfly, and parasitic wasps. If you want to transplant it out, this time frame is a great time to start it. Before I continue, if you're finding value in this content, I would love it if you would consider liking, subscribing, or sharing it so that we can continue to help more people find joy in growing. 6 weeks before last frost, I would sow everything in this bag along with anything in the 8-week bag that I didn't get around to starting. During the 6-week mark is when I start amaranth. Amaranth is actually a grain. It loves heat and there's lots of different types and they have some really cool shapes and colors. Basil. I love growing basil as a filler for bouquets, although you do have to wait until the plant is more mature to get good vase life on it. Lemon and lime basil are both slower to grow, so I think I'm gonna even start them earlier than 6 weeks. I'll start them at 8 weeks before last frost this year. Carthamus or safflower. I grew this for the first time last year. Carthamus is a one and done filler flower that you can start in this time frame. And there's red, orange, and there's a white. Cosmos you can start at this time, along with Didiscus or lace flower. Lace flower, you do have to be careful not to disturb the roots when transplanting because it really prefers to be direct sown, but you can transplant it. 4 o'clocks, honeywort, marigold, and also spider flower. And also on this list I have sunflowers, just because if you are wanting to transplant out sunflowers early, like 2 to 4 weeks before your last frost, you can try starting them in this time frame. Sunflowers are actually somewhat frost hardy, and they will tolerate some freezing if they're hardened off well. Then 2 to 5 weeks before last frost, or here I have 2 to 6 weeks. This is when I will grow my zinnias and sunflowers that I want to transplant out to get the earliest blooms. This is also a good time to start nasturtium for transplanting. Nasturtium is another great companion plant for the vegetable garden. And the last 2 groups are seeds that can be direct sown. So if you're not in a rush to get blooms as quickly as possible in the spring and summer, it is super easy to sow seeds directly into the ground, keep them watered, and then the plants will sprout up and immediately adapt to all of the conditions outside, the sun, the weather, the wind, the temperatures. And it saves a lot of steps growing out baby plants. So starting the seeds indoors, hardening them off, and then also transplanting the plants. And if you sow some of the same flowers that you started earlier indoors or in the greenhouse, you'll be succession sowing, and you'll have some staggered bloom times and more beautiful flowers for longer in the season. This group is the more cool loving plants that you can direct sow before the last frost in the springtime. You just want to wait until your daytime high temperatures reach somewhere between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 to 16 degrees Celsius, and you can sow them directly outside. Just make sure that they stay moist and they'll germinate. Many of these I've already actually direct sown last fall in order to have them overwinter in my zone, but they can be direct sown when soil is not frozen and when soil is still cooler than 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. Agarostema or corn cockle does really well direct sown. Sweet alyssum is on this list to direct sow. Bells of Ireland. I love Bells of Ireland. It's gorgeous. I direct sow it in the fall, but it can also be sown in early spring in cooler zones so that you have blooms in late spring. Bupleurum can be direct sown before a last frost, as well as calendula, clarkia, didiscus or lace flower, dill. Then there's larkspur. I do like to direct sow larkspur in the fall, like I said, and it readily reseeds, but it can also be direct sown before last frost in the spring. Then there's nasturtium. Nasturtium actually likes a little bit of freezing and thawing to soften the seed's outer shell, so I found that that works to sow it during this time. Also nigella or love in a mist, phlox, poppy. Poppy I do prefer to direct sow in the fall. Hollyhock is slower to bloom and has longer days to maturity, so it probably won't bloom the first year for you if you direct sow it during this time frame, but it'll likely bloom the following spring for you and put out all sorts of blooms. Sweet pea can also be direct sown while the soil is still cool. I'll soak the seeds overnight before sowing them out in the garden. And stock can also be direct sown in early spring as well. And the last group is the seeds that love to be direct sown in warm soil. So soil that's at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. You can sow these seeds before this time frame while the soil is still cool, but they'll most likely wait to germinate until the soil warms anyway, and the germination rates can be more erratic. The warm soil is really their trigger to wake up and start their life cycle. Basil. If you let basil go to seed, you'll most likely notice volunteers pop up everywhere in the fall and spring. And when you sow it in warm soil, basil's really quick to germinate and grow. Celosia. Celosia can also be sown into warm soil. The seeds are kind of tiny, so I like to kind of overseed if I'm direct sowing it into the soil. I also like to direct sow dahlia seed. So many varieties of dahlia seed are only 80 to 85 days to bloom. And many people in cooler climates can even get away with direct sowing them and getting blooms. Then there's 4 o'clocks, gomphrena, marigold. And this is also the time to direct sow hyacinth bean vine and scarlet runner bean. Both of those can be used for cut flowers and have beautiful blooms on these vines. I like to soak those seeds overnight before sowing them out in the garden. And then sunflowers. Sunflowers can be succession sown weekly for a constant supply of blooms throughout the summer. And last but not least is zinnias. Zinnias love to be direct sown into warm soil. They're super easy to grow. They come in tons of colors, and I like to succession sow zinnias every 3 to 6 weeks to have a constant supply of zinnias. So I think that's all the flowers. So I hope that this list of flowers has been helpful for you. Feel free to check out the totally free printable cards and the date calendar. They're both linked in the description below. I hope they'll help you in your effort to grow flowers from seed this year. And I would love to hear what you're growing in the comments below. I'll also answer any questions that you leave me in the comments as well. I wish you joy, and I'll see you next time.